Tonight, somewhere around 9 or 10 o'clock, you're probably going to make a small decision most people never think twice about, whether to reach for something to eat before bed. That one small decision repeated most nights of your life may be quietly working with your kidneys or quietly working against them. And in a few minutes, I'm going to tell you about a simple food that for most people over 60 tends to be the better choice, and just as importantly, what it's actually replacing. My name's Dr. Robert Vance. If you're over 60 and watching this, I want you to know you're not alone in never having thought much about this. Kidney health isn't something most of us consider until a lab result surprises us, or a friend mentions their doctor flagged their blood pressure. Part of what makes the kidneys tricky is that they tend to do their work quietly for years, often without producing symptoms you'd notice day to day. That's not meant to alarm you. It's meant to explain why small, sustainable habits built now tend to matter more than waiting for a warning sign that may never show up clearly on its own. So let me ask you the way I would if you were sitting across from me in my office. How old are you, and has your kidney function actually been checked? A simple blood test your doctor may have already ordered as part of routine blood work without making much of it. A lot of people genuinely don't know one way or the other. That's common, and it's an easy thing to ask about at your next visit. Now, let's get to the food, because I did promise you that, and I don't want to keep you waiting through a long preamble to get there. For most older adults without significant dietary restrictions, a modest portion of berries, blueberries, or a mix if you like variety, roughly what would fit in the palm of your hand, tends to be a reasonable bedtime choice. Not a miracle food, not a treatment, just a sensible swap for the kind of thing a lot of us reach for late in the evening without really thinking about it. A bowl of ice cream, a few cookies, a glass of juice. I want to be precise about why, because this is a place where a lot of health content overstates things, and I don't want to do that to you. There is no strong evidence that blueberries become uniquely protective for your kidneys simply because you eat them at night. Your kidneys don't work differently at 10 p.m. than they do at 10 a.m. The reason berries make sense as a bedtime choice has very little to do with timing and almost everything to do with what they're replacing. If your usual nighttime habit is something heavy in added sugar or refined starch, swapping it for a modest fiber-containing whole food is a genuinely different pattern for your blood sugar and your overall diet. And that pattern, repeated consistently, is what actually matters for long-term kidney and metabolic health. The clock has very little to do with it. Let me tell you why berries specifically, rather than just any fruit. They're relatively low in natural sugar compared to many other fruits. And the sugar they do contain comes packaged with real fiber, which slows down how that sugar enters your bloodstream, a gentler effect on blood glucose than something like juice, ice cream, or refined sweets tends to produce. They're also relatively lower in potassium compared to fruits like bananas or oranges, which can matter for some people managing potassium intake, though I want to flag right away that potassium needs vary enormously from person to person, and I'll come back to that shortly. And they contain plant compounds that have been studied for their role in supporting healthy blood vessels. Genuinely interesting research, but I want to be careful here too. I am not telling you that blueberries treat, cure, reverse, or repair anything. I'm telling you that as an everyday bedtime choice, they represent a pattern that's generally gentler on your blood sugar than many typical late night snacks. And a body that isn't constantly managing large blood sugar swings tends to have kidneys with an easier overall job. It's worth pausing on why blood sugar and kidney health are so closely linked in the first place, because I don't want to just assert the connection without explaining it. Your kidneys contain millions of tiny filtering units, and the blood vessels feeding those filters are quite small and quite delicate. Over years, consistently elevated blood sugar can gradually damage those small vessels, the same way it can affect small vessels in the eyes and in the nerves of the feet, which is part of why diabetes management and kidney health are so often discussed together. This isn't something that happens from one dessert or even one indulgent week. It's a slow cumulative process shaped by the pattern of what someone eats and how well their blood sugar stays regulated over years, not any single meal. That's exactly why a modest, consistent swap, a food that's gentler on blood sugar most nights, rather than one dramatic dietary change made once, tends to matter more than people expect. But there's a detail many people miss here, and I think it's worth being honest about, because oversimplifying it does you no favors. Some content suggests your body simply can't handle sugar at night the way it can during the day, as if your metabolism shuts off when you sleep. That's not really accurate, and I don't want to leave you with a myth just to make a point. What's true is simpler. A large sugary snack adds to your overall glucose exposure for the day, regardless of what hour it happens, and for people with diabetes or any impaired glucose regulation, that response can be more pronounced and worth watching more closely. Whole fruit, because of its fiber, behaves differently in your body than juice or a refined dessert does. That distinction is real and matters. But it isn't really about nighttime being a uniquely vulnerable window. It's about what you're regularly putting into your body. And berries simply tend to be a gentler choice than many of the alternatives people reach for late in the day. Now, how much is reasonable? For most people, something like 3/4 of a cup to a cup is a sensible portion, enough to feel satisfying without turning a modest snack into a large one. More is not automatically better here. The goal is a reasonable, enjoyable portion that fits into your evening, not a strict rule to obsess over. And here's where I need to be genuinely careful because this next part matters more than anything I've said so far. If you've been diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, particularly at a more advanced stage, your dietary needs may look quite different from this general guidance. Some people with reduced kidney function are specifically advised to limit potassium because their kidneys can no longer clear excess potassium as efficiently, and elevated potassium can become a serious problem. Others may have fluid restrictions or specific protein guidance, all individualized to their particular labs and health history. If that describes you, please don't take general advice from any video, mine included, and apply it directly without checking with your nephrologist, your physician, or a registered renal dietitian first. They know your actual situation. A general video never can. The same caution applies in a somewhat different way. If you're managing diabetes, berries in a modest, consistent portion are generally considered a reasonable choice compared to many other sweet options, but portion size still matters. And individual responses to any carbohydrate, even one package with fiber, do vary from person to person. If you monitor your blood sugar at home, it's worth simply paying attention to how your own body responds to a given portion rather than assuming any general guidance applies to you exactly as stated. And if you're on blood thinners, it's worth knowing that very large, consistent intakes of certain vitamin K containing foods can matter for those medications. Berries aren't typically a concern in that category the way leafy greens can be, but it's the kind of question worth a quick check with your pharmacist if you're ever unsure about a food and a medication interacting. Now, let me tell you about someone I'll call Margaret, and I want to be upfront that Margaret is a composite, a fictional example built from patterns I've seen repeatedly over the years. Not one specific patient. Margaret was 68, and by her own account, ate reasonably well most days. Vegetables, sensible dinner portions, not much fast food. But almost every night, once the dishes were done and she'd settled into her chair for television, she'd have a bowl of ice cream or a few cookies with a glass of juice. In her mind, this wasn't really eating. It was winding down, a small treat earned after an otherwise sensible day. And on any single night, she wasn't wrong. One bowl of ice cream harms no one's kidneys. What she hadn't fully accounted for was that this pattern, repeated most nights for years, added a steady cumulative stream of added sugar right at the end of every day. Not one bad night, a quiet, repeated pattern. Exactly the kind of thing that slips past our own self-assessment, because we tend to judge our diets by our biggest meals, not our smallest. Most automatic habits. This is where the story becomes more interesting, because Margaret wasn't doing anything most people would call obviously unhealthy. Her habit was subtle. That's precisely why it's worth examining your own evening pattern, honestly, the way she eventually did. Margaret swapped her nightly bowl of ice cream for a modest portion of mixed berries most nights, kept an occasional treat for when she genuinely wanted one rather than out of pure habit, and made a couple of other small changes alongside it, which I'll get to shortly. At her next physical several months later, her fasting blood sugar and blood pressure had both improved modestly. I want to be honest with you, we can't credit that entirely to one snack swap, since she changed a few habits together and everyone's body responds differently. What mattered most, in my view, wasn't the specific numbers. It was that the changes were small enough to actually stick. She was still doing them a year later. And that consistency is really the whole point. Before we go further, there's a myth I want to correct because it trips people up constantly, and it's directly relevant to what we've just discussed. A lot of people assume that if a snack is natural, fruit juice, honey instead of white sugar, it must automatically be fine. I understand the instinct, but natural sugar still affects your blood sugar, and the form matters more than people expect. A glass of fruit juice delivers a concentrated dose of sugar quickly, without the fiber that whole fruit provides to slow that absorption. Whole fruit and fruit juice behave differently in your body, even from the exact same fruit. This doesn't make juice dangerous or forbidden. It simply means whole fruit tends to be the better everyday choice, particularly in the evening. The food itself, though, is really only part of the picture, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I stopped here, because a few other evening habits matter just as much, and one of them in particular tends to quietly undo the benefit of even a thoughtful snack choice. Sodium is the first one, and it trips up a lot of well-meaning people. Many assume they eat low sodium because they don't add much salt at the table, but the overwhelming majority of sodium in a typical diet doesn't come from the salt shaker. It comes from processed and packaged foods, including things that don't taste particularly salty. Certain breads, sauces, canned soups, and deli meats can carry a surprising amount. I've had patients genuinely surprised to learn that an ordinary slice of bread can carry more sodium than a small bag of chips. It simply doesn't announce itself the way an obviously salty snack does, since sodium plays a direct role in blood pressure, and blood pressure is one of the most significant factors in long-term kidney health. This is worth real attention, not elimination, just awareness of where it's actually coming from. Hydration is the second, and I want to correct a myth here too, though more carefully than I sometimes hear it corrected elsewhere. Some people believe drinking a large amount of water right before bed is especially good for their kidneys. More water, more flushing, more support. For most healthy adults, though, consistent hydration spread across the whole day tends to be more practical and more genuinely useful than a large volume right before sleep, which mostly just means more trips to the bathroom overnight, disrupted sleep, and for many older adults, increased fall risk from getting up in the dark. I gently encourage most people to front load their hydration earlier in the day and taper off somewhat in the hour or two before bed. I want to be careful not to overstate this as a universal rule though. If you're managing heart failure, kidney disease, or you've been given specific fluid guidance by your doctor, follow that individualized advice over anything general I say here, since fluid needs in those situations are often deliberately different. And this next habit is surprisingly common and worth mentioning honestly without moralizing about it. A lot of people don't think of a glass of wine or a nightcap as part of their food routine at all, so it rarely gets evaluated the way a snack does. I'm not telling you that an occasional evening drink is a guaranteed problem for your kidneys. It isn't. And I don't want to shame anyone over a normal, moderate habit. What I'd ask you to consider is the regular pattern, because alcohol affects hydration, can affect blood pressure, interacts with a fairly long list of common medications, and for many people, disrupts the quality of deep sleep, which itself plays a role in overnight blood pressure regulation. If you've built a genuinely thoughtful evening routine otherwise, it's worth an honest, judgment-free look at whether regular alcohol close to bedtime is quietly working against some of that effort. And protecting your actual sleep matters here too, more than people expect. Chronic sleep disruption has been associated with higher blood pressure and less stable blood sugar regulation over time, both of which connect back to kidney health. This is part of why bedtime habits matter at all in a conversation about kidneys. It was never really only about one snack. It's about the whole last hour or two of your evening, because that window sets the stage for what your body does hormonally and metabolically for the many hours you're asleep. I want to say something directly to you now because it matters more than any single fact in this video. You do not need to overhaul your entire evening routine tonight. You don't need to eliminate every treat or weigh every gram of sodium. That kind of dramatic approach rarely lasts. What tends to actually work, in my experience watching patients over many years, is picking one or two specific concrete changes, a modest portion of berries instead of a sugary dessert, moving most of your water intake earlier in the day, a bit more awareness of where sodium hides in your usual foods, and sticking with those for a few months before adding anything else. Small, consistent choices genuinely do add up in a way that a short burst of dramatic effort usually doesn't. Let me bring this together with a simple, realistic routine you could actually keep in mind tonight. Choose a modest, satisfying bedtime snack rather than a large one. A small portion of berries or another whole food option if berries aren't for you, rather than something heavy in added sugar. Stay mindful of sodium across your day, particularly from packaged foods, not just the salt shaker. Spread your water intake across the day rather than loading up right before bed, unless your own doctor has told you otherwise. Take an honest look at regular alcohol close to bedtime if that's part of your routine. Protect your sleep as its own health habit, not an afterthought. And if you haven't had your kidney function checked recently, ask about it at your next visit. It's one simple blood test, and it replaces guesswork with actual information. If you live with chronic kidney disease, diabetes, heart failure, or any condition involving fluid or mineral restrictions, please treat everything here as general information and let your physician or a registered renal dietitian guide the specifics of your own diet. Their guidance, built around your actual labs and history, will always serve you better than anything a general video can offer, mine included. Kidney health was never going to come down to one perfect food, and I hope that's clear by now. It comes down to a series of small, fairly unremarkable choices repeated consistently that quietly add up over months and years. That's less dramatic than a miracle food headline, I know, but it's honest and it's the kind of advice that actually holds up over time. I genuinely like to know how old are you and what's your usual go-to when you feel hungry at night. Tell me in the comments, I read them. If this was useful, consider subscribing because I'll be covering more of these everyday habits that quietly shape long-term health after 60. And if you know someone who reaches for something sweet every night without thinking twice about it, a parent, a spouse, a friend, consider sending this their way. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.